Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing on the need to reauthorize the EPA's Brownfields Program. The Brownfields Program has a long history of supporting safe and responsible redevelopment. And since its inception, it has made nearly 10,000 properties ready for reuse, many of which are in my home state of California, many of which are in my hometown of Los Angeles, and many of which are literally in my backyard in the neighborhood where I grew up in Pacoima, California. I've seen and worked on these issues as a state legislator, putting state government resources to leverage with federal resources in redevelopment. And I'm familiar with these efforts. Once upon a time, as a city council member, trying to navigate some of these cleanup efforts and efforts at redevelopment for productive use and economic benefit, often in underserved communities. Mr. Busher, I appreciated your written testimony for touching on the challenges of deindustrialization. The example I want to focus on today is actually not in my backyard, but in the city and county of San Francisco. The shipping industry was the lifeblood of San Francisco's Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood for decades, and the concentration of industrial sites has resulted in more than 150 brownfields in Bayview Hunters Point, many of which are now further threatened by sea level rise. So we see a convergence of challenges here. The actual shipyard itself is now a federal Superfund site and one of America's most polluted places. Now, just last week, San Francisco broke ground on a project that will connect disadvantaged communities in Bayview Hunters Point to the kind of outdoor recreation opportunities that other shoreline neighborhoods in San Francisco have long enjoyed. Working with the EPA and a diverse group of community partners, San Francisco is redeveloping a 13-mile corridor of green space with trails and parks along the waterfront. Redevelopment of this site would not have been possible without first cleaning up the contaminated soil, debris, and structures on the property, efforts which were supported by EPA's Brownfields Program. Now, in a few short years, thanks to this program, the community members in Bayview Hunters Point will be able to enjoy shoreline trails on what was once an abandoned and blighted former industrial site. Now, this project was successful thanks to the engagement and support from various state and local entities. While the project received almost $350,000 from the EPA Brownfields Program, the city also leveraged separate EPA funds as well as other sources of funding. But not every environmental justice community has the same access to technical assistance to be able to complete projects. There are surely other federal agencies that can and should be brought into the brownfields redevelopment projects. So my question is actually for Mr. Goldstein. How should we think about a whole of government approach to funding brownfield redevelopment projects and improving interagency coordination?
That is a great question, Senator. I'm glad you asked it. You're absolutely right. There are other agencies that should be part of this conversation and should be providing resources. I identified 3 that are under this committee's jurisdiction in my testimony earlier this morning. The Federal Highway Administration, the Army Corps of Engineers, which has massive resources to bring to the table and can absolutely partner and collaborate with environmental justice communities in an immediate and very material way, and the Economic Development Administration. The EPA has put out a wonderful guidance document, which they've been doing every several years, called the Federal Brownfields Program, which identifies aspirational brownfield agendas within 24 different federal agencies and departments. But if you look at what's actually happening in the brownfields universe, really EPA is the only agency that has any meaningful involvement. So what I would suggest is a corollary to a friendly amendment to the testimony I gave earlier. Have EDA convene a national brownfields summit. Bring representatives from each of those 24 agencies and departments to the table, along with private and public sector stakeholders, state, local, tribal, NGOs, environmental justice, etc., and collectively identify what human resources and financial resources each of these agencies that are already part of a federal brownfields constellation can bring to the table. And specific to reauthorization, which is what this hearing is about, again, we recommend new funding resources be allocated specifically to the Corps, specifically to EDA, and specifically to FHA for these purposes. And let's put our thumb on the scale to prioritize funding for EJ communities and rural communities.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I know my time is up. I'd like to ask one quick follow-up question for Mr. Goldstein. Another reason this project was so successful is because San Francisco accounted for potential climate change and sea level rise impacts by using EPA's Brownfields Cleanup Alternatives checklist. For example, they chose soil excavation as the preferred cleanup method as opposed to remediation because it would reduce the risk of remobilizing soil contaminants as sea levels continue to rise. How can the EPA ensure that climate change and potential sea level rise are adequately considered during brownfield redevelopment efforts? And if I can ask for a brief response, and we'll continue the conversation after the hearing.
Absolutely, Senator Padilla, thank you. And I'm glad you asked the question because it gives me an opportunity to supplement my response to Senator Whitehouse on this very same issue. EPA is laser focused on climate change and brownfields. They've released several guidance documents that are encyclopedic in the way in which they approach this particular challenge, including focusing on, as you pointed out, source removal in coastal areas as a remedy. Why is that important? That's important because if you leave contaminated soil in place and it's subject to flooding, the waters rise and soak through that contaminated material. And like a sponge that may contain hot chocolate that's wiped up from a kitchen counter, that material is going to leak out of the soil or the sponge and further exacerbate contamination in communities. So our remedies at the regulatory level should be focused on source removal as the first component of a climate change strategy for brownfields.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I know my time is up. I'll submit questions for the record relative to the recommendation or suggestions of codifying some of our environmental justice and equity directives into the Brownfields program.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining us and for your participation and questions.